joining us. Christoph, if you want to start recording now.
Yeah.
This would work. So thanks for volunteering your sunny, beautiful Sunday afternoon to join us. Feels like another weird secular version of church, kind of. We have 4 projects to look at this afternoon. We combined in our department the grad and undergrad reviews, in part just because of our numbers. So we have 1 graduate student presenting third in the lineup, and then 3 undergraduate presentations. And so let me just introduce our jury. So Mitchell at some point will join us. Mitchell Desharnais is principal of LAMDJ in Los Angeles. He attended Cal State Long Beach School of Fine Arts and UCLA Graduate School of Architecture and Urban Planning. Mitchell has practiced in the US, France, Germany, India, and Egypt. During his employment at Snøhetta Architects, he managed the design of the interiors for the Library of Alexandria. His current practice spans public art, landscape, and architectural design. Mitchell has taught at SCI-Arc, Otis College of Art and Design, UCLA, and is currently on the faculty at Cal Poly Pomona, where his varied professional and teaching experience provides a background for the graduate and undergraduate design courses that he teaches there. Tim Durfee, who is in the bottom right corner of my screen. Tim is principal of Tim Durfee Studio, an interdisciplinary architecture studio based here in Los Angeles. Tim was faculty and director of the Visual Studies program at SCI-Arc when I was there many moons ago, and is currently the, quote, architect in the Media Design Practices MFA program at Art Center College of Design, which is curated to represent different perspectives on design, along with a technologist, a filmmaker, a graphic designer, an anthropologist, and a social researcher. Together, they reconceived, restructured, and renamed the program to create a new type of advanced design degree to address new contexts, mediums, and methods in design. At Art Center, Tim founded AMP, a studio for multimodal projects exploring the changing relevancy of architecture in the age of media. And then we have Naraneh Nazarian. Naraneh and actually we taught together in the MArch program, I don't know how many years ago now, 6 or 7 years ago maybe, at Woodbury. Naraneh is on the faculty at UCLA and is founder and principal of MN Office, a design practice based in LA and Yerevan, did I say that right? Engaged in the production of speculative and built projects that study and cultivate works of cultural, spatial, and material interest. She was a 2016-2017 Fulbright Scholar, and her design work has garnered various accolades, including 2 AIA Design Excellence Awards and the 2006 PA Award Grand Prize. Prior to establishing MN Office, she was an architectural associate at Gary Partners for 9 years, where she played a key role on numerous architectural projects completed and under construction internationally. She has taught design courses at SCI-Arc and Woodbury, and her work has been published in Progressive Architecture, GA, Architectural Record, Interior Design, and Metropolis. Our very remote non-Californian on the call today is Tian Ning, who's calling in from Michigan. Tian and I met at the McDowell Colony 6 years ago? 2014, yeah, almost 6 years ago. Tian is the principal of an independent architecture and art practice with built works in the United States and China. She is also an assistant professor of architecture at the University of Michigan's Taubman College of College of Architecture and Urban Planning. She received her Master of Architecture from Cornell, as well as a Master of Architecture and Bachelor of Professional Studies from the State University of New York at Buffalo. Her practice, collaborative in nature and interdisciplinary in scope, ranges in scale from textile manufacturing facilities to commercial retail interiors or installations. Common to both practices are projects that deal with questions of labor in various facets and forms, underscoring broader issues of industrial manufacturing, human crafting, technology, and aesthetics. Her material-based research and design primarily focus on textile manipulation and experimental concrete forming, incorporating contemporary technologies to develop novel designs and innovative ways of building and manufacturing. Hold on, I've got some stuff in the chat here. Okay. Aethar, I'll get that to him in a minute. Oops, sorry, I'm managing a lot of information on one screen at the moment. And then finally, we have our esteemed Dean, Ingela Walrus-Twitter, on the call. As well as being our Dean, she is also an architect, educator, and design consultant specializing in the building envelope and the experimental architectural use of glass. She has taught at Yale University, Cornell, the Bartlett, and SCI-Arc, in addition to Woodbury. She is also director of WUHO, the Woodbury University Hollywood Gallery, a venue for experimental installations, public lectures, and workshops. She currently serves on the LA Forum Board of Directors. She was elevated to an AIA Fellow in 2018, and was the recipient of the 2016 AIA California Council Educator Award, was honored also in 2018 with the AIA LA Presidential Educator of the Year Award, and has been recognized twice in 2018 and 2019 by Design Intelligence as one of the nation's most admired educators in architecture and design. So we have yet again a heavy-hitting roster of folks this afternoon, which is very exciting. Tim, can you see the chat box?
No, I can't. I can't. All I can see is Christoph Corner's screen that is shared. It says you are viewing Christoph Corner's screen.
Okay.
And then I can see the list of participants. I don't see a chat box, and I also have a question for you. Can you see me physically? Can you see me?
No.
Is there? Okay. Okay.
Do you want to just because we have a few minutes and Mitchell's trying to call in, do you want to try and log off and log back in with that link that I just emailed to you?
Yeah, I'll try that. Yeah.
Okay, let's see if that works.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
I have to say, for half a semester online, if this is the worst technological issue that we've had, I am really impressed.
Yeah, so I have sat on, this is my 16th review in the last 3 days. I'm not joking.
Mm-hmm.
And it has gone so much more smoothly than one would anticipate, given critics from all over the world. So
yeah.
Plus the streaming, I think, it's worked out really nicely. And you're lucky that you have a tech chair.
I know. I was just saying to Christoph that having someone running that side of things just is like a few less things to think about. It's an enormous help.
Exactly.
My pleasure, no problem. Happy to do it. Even though earlier we had parts of the projects cut off, but that's fixed.
Yeah. I had padded in plenty of time for us to troubleshoot anything, so we're not going to be running late, which is good.
Well, it will end with happy hour either way.
I mean, everything always ends with happy hour. So.
Yep.
It could also be going on with happy hour, you know. You never know.
This is also true. This is also true. So while we're waiting for Tim and Mitchell to log back in. Sadak, are you ready to go? Are you queued up? Okay, good. I'll just give them a couple more minutes here. Hi, Thomas and Branka.
Hello.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you all.
Thanks for joining us.
Hello. Yeah, I couldn't wait to watch. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. Oh, Tim, we can see you. Fantastic.
All right.
And we can see Mitchell. Yay.
Come in peace.
We're all here, all teed up and ready to go.
Okay.
So I introduced you while you were wrangling the technology.
Thank you.
So everyone knows of your brilliance and your, your Legion accolades.
Hey, Mitchell.
Good to see you, Tim.
See ya.
And Christophe and
Hello.
Heather.
Good to see you, Christoph.
Hello, good to see you too.
Veronica, nice to meet you, and Thomas. I look forward to seeing everybody.
Yeah, and then we also have Tien calling in from Michigan, which is fantastic, and Narane from UCLA also joining us,
Awesome.
and Ingol, of course. So we can get started. There's 4 projects to look at. Mitchell and Tim, just in case you missed this, we have 3 undergrad thesis projects and 1 grad. And then we will have sufficient time at the end to do what I love most, which is digression. So
How long will this each project be reviewed for?
half an hour. So Sadak is going to start us off.
Okay.
Is that visible
Yep.
for everyone? Okay. Hello, everyone. So my name is Sadak, and my project is called Soft Separation. So ambiguous space, that is a space between conditioned and unconditioned environments, yields varying degrees of literal and phenomenal transparency. Conditioned meaning a sealed space in which the air is contained within a room, and unconditioned being that the air has a means of escape. Finding a hybridization between the various degrees through understanding the mechanisms of each project is what's propelling me to study each unique precedent. With the information that I obtain, I will devise a way of representing. Sue Fujimoto's N house, for example, has these layers, has these physical layers of space that act almost like an onion. There's a clear physical ambiguity among the spaces in terms of physical space, whereas Philip Johnson's glass house has a distinct separation. Yet optically, it's incredibly ambiguous. Each qualifier has principles that in a way have their own DNA in terms of what effect they're trying to portray. I want to extract this DNA and create a way of blurring the separation between the two. So my site is the Schindler House, and Rudolf Schindler built a home for him and his wife, as well as another married couple and their children in 1922, following a camping trip to Yosemite and close on the heels of the 1918 outbreak of the Spanish influenza. The project sought to formalize the experiences that the group had living in canvas tents apart from clocks and schedules, and to assert a radical declaration of personal space where each member of the house had their own undifferentiated room. Nearly a century later, we're facing a comparable global pandemic, and questions about physical boundary, cohabitation, domesticity arise. This thesis seeks to revisit the site, both physical and conceptual, of the Schindler House in West Hollywood, and to renegotiate the terrains of boundary, surface, containment, visibility, and community through the material possibilities of textile logic. So I have a short stop motion animation that depicts what this curtain can do, because there's a lot of movement in my project. So this is the first plan. It labels all of the spaces, and this is the animation. So given that we're celebrating the 100-year anniversary of the Schindler Project, and recent events given the pandemic of COVID-19 and the protection and isolation of individuals in an environment is detrimental in order to limit the amount of exposure that people are having with one another. With this in mind, I began to look at the ways in which we can begin to separate spaces while taking into consideration factors such as transparency and opacity in order to create, in order to limit the openness of a space and creating a habitat in which there's a stronger separation between individuals coexisting within a space. The canvas and concrete in this building have a really interesting relationship to each other. And initially I looked at how, how they came together. And every time you have a relationship between two materials, there's a dominant and a subservient. And the goal was to shift the relationship between the two and allow the canvas to take on a stronger role in manipulating these spaces. So I have some cuts through the building that show various scenes that are happening, such as this being cut through the dining table, and you have a moment where there's an inside-outside space that's created. There's a shared sink in between this separated textile, and you can see the sleeping baskets up over there in the corner. So the textile begins to weave and flow within the space, creating pockets and separation in order to radically change the environment at any given moment, similar to the state of a pandemic. Ideally, representation of specific scenarios and configurations, you're able to see the different configurations of the curtain and how it can respond to the environment in a myriad of ways. And that's a more zoomed in moment where you can see the kitchen detailing, and you can also see the stairs leading up to the sleeping baskets, the spaces created within these pockets, and this there's areas of inside and outside. And that is it.
Thank you, C-Doc. Can you start again? Can you just read your sort of two-sentence thesis statement?
Oh, okay. I would say that this thesis seeks to revisit the site, both physically and conceptual, of the Schindler House in West Hollywood, and to renegotiate the terrains of boundary, surface, containment, visibility, and community through the material possibilities of textile logics.
Very well said, thank you.
Okay.
Doc, did you mention the kind of amendment that you're making to the familial structure of the occupants? I'm not sure if you mentioned it. I think it's worth discussing. Who lives here now, basically?
Oh, okay. So given that initially they were all separate spaces for families, and when we look at this building, there's sort of these three separate spaces within the whole. And I visualize it being sort of a group of people communally, whether that's like couples and heterosexual or homosexual relationships raising children, in that there's ways in which each family has their own separate wing of the home, but then there's also ways that all of these curtains can be pulled and expanded in a sense to create a larger sense of community amongst these three families.
What would be the maximum occupancy you can imagine for it in the transformed state?
I would say about 3 couples and 2 kids would most likely be, one couple in the guest, another couple in Schindler and his wife's portion, and then another couple in the Chase's portion. And there's sort of these pockets of space that are smaller, meant for a smaller child, like a nursery. But I think it could accommodate about 3 families, early families maybe.
Can you quickly scroll through your drawings again for us?
The plans?
Just all of the drawings. Maybe
Oh,
slowly
okay.
go again.
Let me know if I'm going too fast. I don't know.
Doc, I have a few questions. I wonder if I could ask them as you're scrolling through your drawings. I guess first is, are the material qualities of the textile important to you? And if they can, or they may or may not be, and I guess similar to that, how do you decipher, for instance, in these diagrams, how do you decipher how the textile is infilled into the field condition of the Schindler House? Does the house provide that framework for you, or do you invent or add a framework for this soft intervention to be received?
I think I think there was always like this idea of the house being very radical to begin with, and I really wanted to have a design in there that challenges that radical initial design. I'm sorry, I might have lost a little bit of what the question was.
I guess the first one was about whether you care what the material qualities of this intervention are. You may not, because you're not necessarily getting into it in the presentation. So I want to make sure I don't make comments about that if that's not on the table for you. And then I guess secondly, if you're deploying the system into the house, does the house provide a particular framework for receiving the system, or are you having to like create a framework, to receive the system as well?
So for the first question, I think what was the most important, an aspect that was important was the idea of transparency, and to sort of see a space, but maybe not occupy. You want to be able to sort of have that separation, but not in a solid form. And so I do believe that transparency it's an important part of the project that I felt was that I wanted to make sure was that it was important, the transparency. And then in terms of how the project in its initial build, the way is that the concrete was a lot more prioritized than the canvas. And so for this new edition that I'm doing, or this re-edition, I really wanted to change those 2 hierarchies. And that's really why I kind of took the canvas or textile as more of the material that it's, in a way, it's still following the curvature and the overall building form that the concrete had, but it's manipulating it in a way that it's not like it was before. And it's a lot radically different than it was. I hope those answered the questions.
Thanks for the presentation. I'm wondering whether you could talk a little bit about your decisions in terms of, it seems like in these diagrams, and especially this time-lapse one, that there's a kind of precision in which you have kind of articulated the green. I assume is the canvas, the textile boundaries. Could you talk a little bit about the decisions as to how they're deployed? Because I see there's you mentioned there's interior and exterior relationships. Could you speak a little bit about that? And also,
Okay.
you talk about the radical aspect to the house, and perhaps maybe as a way of sort of jumping off of what you mean by the radical. How is your intervention playing with that?
Okay. So I guess maybe to answer your first question, there are moments in the plan, such as, like takes for instance this corner, where the textile eventually comes into the interior of the building. And in a sense, it begins to separate the bathroom being a shower curtain. And so it starts to do that in a lot of these areas, like here, for instance, and here, as well as here. And that kind of led a lot of the formal design decisions based on those areas. And so kind of just allowing the general flow of the building to stay the same, but have these moments where if there is a separation, it begins to separate from that and then continue outward. And the canvas almost like it wraps in between these spaces that are created between the gaps of the concrete. And so that was really how I formulated most of the design decisions. We're just kind of just like imagining actually wrapping this building.
Okay, so there's a kind of bleeding out, right? Like literally through the cracks of the concrete panels. And in doing that, how does it radicalize the existing relationships? So for instance, you talked about the different families that were there, but now also a different composition. How are the boundaries redefined in the bleeding? And if I remember correctly, having visited this place a long time ago, is there also in that process an understanding of how the public and private are organized, or in your case, reorganized through that?
I think when I look at the initial building and how there wasn't that sense of this like softed canvas that was beginning to create these pockets of spaces, initially there's clear distinctions between inside and outside. And I think creating this idea of this blurriness, it goes back towards when the house was lived in by all of these people with these couples. There was a lot of mingling between the two, and so there was a lot of sneaking around and a lot of opening and closing of doors and stuff. And so I feel like by allowing this sort of softed curtain and these softed spaces, you're able to kind of go in and out of these areas a lot more soundly. And so I think the assertion that I'm trying to make is, what was once, I guess, more hidden, although it was known, is maybe more displayed now.
So I'll jump right in here. I think these drawings in particular are incredibly beautiful. And you've taken a building that, when I think about it, this super solid concrete, heavy walls, and then and it's also of course a historically preserved building, and then in a really deceptively gentle way violated the building, right, with the insertion of these diaphanous walls or these diaphanous curtain walls. And I think that that's really powerful. And I would, if I were to ask one more thing of you, it would be to, when you describe your project and when I asked you to just define your thesis, it would be to both in plan and in these sort of axonometric views to define your terms. In other words, you talked about boundary, surface, containment. You used a number of those words, and I think that you have examples of those, and those drove your design decisions, but I would like to see them as a sort of taxonomy clearly identified. And there might be multiple areas that where your curtain can then be modified, as you showed in your animation. But you could really interrogate those and help us then to understand the thought process and the decision making that went into where you located those curtains.
I'd agree, and I think it's really, you've come so close to saying this, but you haven't quite said it, that this house was a kind of social experiment for two couples, which was then rebooted when the Neutras moved in, and as you alluded to, there were numerous moments of the boundaries that the house was meant to establish between those couples, where those boundaries were violated by the couples, with famous infidelities and friendships being destroyed for decades after and all that. And it seems like that's one of the things that's being negotiated here by your insertions into the house. I want to just double up on a couple things that Ingelil said, because I think many of these moments that you would want to isolate to actually drive your thesis home would require a closer reading both of history and the intended social structure of the house. So when you talk about boundaries of what? Boundaries of social intercourse, boundaries of marital territory, boundaries of adults and children, I'm not sure. But you need to say that. And then I think where you deploy the curtain to either disrupt or reconfigure that, I think is a really interesting set of questions.
Yeah, I would have to say I agree with a couple those two comments, in the sense that I think your tracking of the organizational paradigm, in particular in the plan, is really clear. The boundaries that you're shifting or suggesting to kind of be blurred. If I were to ask for kind of anything in addition, I would say, and I have to say that the kind of axonometrics, the X-rayed axonometrics, which, by the way, if I'm guessing you've read Beatrice Colomina's article on the X-ray. If you haven't, I think it would be a great pairing for the project in terms of like talking about or further sort of expanding the definitions of literal and phenomenal transparency. I think that the axonometric X-rays are really good at communicating the idea diagrammatically, but I actually think you've proposed something here that's a kind of erasure or subtraction of this very sort of monolithic structure that Ingelil was talking about, that I think could be really well evaluated in a series of perspectives, because you could essentially X-ray into the home, given your propositions, given your erasure of certain boundaries. And I guess another thing that I might just add or toss in here, as a person like reading the project, not having spent time with it, there's a sense of creating a new type of optical device, like that the introduction of these transparent surfaces, these soft surfaces, are creating an optical device for a viewer to be able to kind of see the house through a different lens. And I also think perspective would, like a non-X-ray oriented perspective, so that you could really get the kind of sense of hard versus soft, translucent versus non-translucent or transparent, I think would be really kind of effective at communicating those ideas that are embedded.
Well, that leads to a question I have is, so what is it canvas? What is the material you're proposing?
I see it as a kind of like a PVC sort of clear wrap.
Oh, I see. Okay, so
Yeah.
now I got in my head canvas was what.
Oh yeah, I thought it was some sort of fabric. We were talking about a sort of diaphanous fabric. Oh, that changed.
So it's kind of like a translucent plastic. It's kind of like a welding shield or something, like those heavy. Okay, because that's something like I also really love the drawings, but I do think that there's a although I'm still kind of catching up to my new information here, but I feel like there's a little bit of a disconnection between, or not disconnection, but just like not enough of a connection between that particular material and the way you're representing your examination of this building. I mean, I think I agree with all the comments before, but I'm kind of like wanting to know more about about that material in specific. Like, it's funny because like a few minutes ago when I was assuming this was fabric, and actually for some reason I latched onto the term canvas, but I was remembering those famous pictures of like Rudolph lounging around like in his kimono and this kind of boho half clothed, who knows what's going on kind of thing. I thought there was something sort of funny and exciting about the idea that this would be kind of the loungewear for the building somehow. It's kind of throws this on at certain times, and I'm just
Hefner.
What's that?
Hugh Hefner.
A little bit, maybe a little Hugh in there. I don't know. Look, I like the diagrammatic dimensions of the scheme, but I guess I'm sort of wanting more about the material realities of the scheme and the ways in which that opens up all sorts of new, like you have this proposal of these beds that are made out of the same material, this kind of like hammocks, which I think is really cool. But I kind of want to know more. You know what I mean? Like I want to know what's that like? Do you just like, is it like a tent and then you just pull out part of the tent and hang out on there? That's really cool to me, but I want to know more.
It's interesting because Sadak and I had a lot of conversations over the last year about the materiality of the textile-like thing, right? And I actually think that Narene's comment about the project almost demanding a new optical device through which to reimagine or to re-see the Schindler House could maybe also be said of materiality. Because I think Sadak, you could actually describe the kind of qualities that you would aspire that kind of textile to have, and what it would amount to is no textile that we can name. Right?
Yeah.
Like you want something that has a certain kind of thickness to it, maybe like felt, but it's transparent, but it's not plastic, and that maybe it has the ability to go in a kind of gradient from transparent to translucent to opaque to reflective.
Yeah.
And so maybe the next kind of dimensionality of the project is actually almost a kind of material science investigation where you're trying to invent a textile that can do all these kinds of things because we simply don't have one yet, right? And then that would simultaneously maybe address Narene's comment about the kind of the optics of the project and the kind of representational issues of how you then represent it as a presentation, right?
I added another reference in the chat. It was Courtney Kaufman, Heather and Christoph, you'll remember, in the first Unmentionable Symposium, and she wrote an essay called Curtain as Wall, where she interrogated modern architecture, the history of modern architecture, and the role of the curtain in that. And I found it such a fantastic essay. And again, I want to, sort of emphasize this is, this deceptively light, the thing that you rarely acknowledge in architecture, And yet what you're doing is you're heightening already this sort of inside-outside flow that the building provides, but then your curtain itself then goes inside and outside and in places that it shouldn't. And I think that's very, I want to know more. I want to see the details. I want to see how it does that. So I think you could spend a whole other year giving us those details. And I think those were some of Narine's first questions. What does the hardware look like, that allows this? We all know how low the ceilings are there. So of course, the mechanism has to be something very, very delicate and very small.
Any final comments for Sadok?
I guess I feel less worried about the dog peeing on the curtain now that it's you can just close it off.
I hadn't noticed.
I think these days that's really not as crucial an issue as it might have been previously.
Well, thank you everyone.
Thanks, Sadok. Congratulations.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so we're moving right along here. Sadok, if you could unshare your screen. We need a synonym for unsharing. It's such an unpleasant term. And next up we have Liana.
I forgot to mute myself. Hey everyone, my name is Liana and my project is called Spatial Papers. And as we are all familiar with wallpaper, we know that it's defined as a two-dimensional planar surface that delivers a one-sided graphic transformation to a space. For my thesis, I am exploring a translation of wallpaper from its two-dimensional nature into its three-dimensional possibilities through the making of graphic and optical experiences. In other words, I am exploring techniques to translate a 2D surface into a three-dimensionalized and spatialized environment. The site for my project is a traditional 1940s suburban home with 5 specified rooms. This diagram shows the joint or shared walls that correspond with the functionality and organization of your home. It also represents the surfaces that the following wallpapers will be assembled to, along with the directionality of the extrusions that will be made throughout the space. The 5 wallpapers that are assigned to each room are as such: the living room, the kitchen, the bath, bedroom, and the other bedroom. Each wallpaper is dissected into multiple layers by color and shape and manipulated to revisit programmatic and communicable settings of a home. This process shows the distribution of the 2D to 3D throughout the volume of the room, creating graphic and functional experiences throughout the space. This causes the person to not only occupy a room, but to also experience its surroundings and wallpaper. This way, each part of the home becomes personal for the user. These drawings of the first living room space show parts of the wallpaper that are extruded at different lengths to create various functional and domestic elements within the space, such as shelving. It also communicates a pathway created by the wallpaper to offer wayfinding and navigate circulation through the space. These drawings of the kitchen describe the exploration of a threshold and how it can become something that is occupiable through a dense space. The other part of the kitchen presents the user with opportunities of domestic functions using the extrusions of the paper, but also creates apertures through the space that create communicable settings. The bath creates opportunities of privacy and an engaging environment. The drawings of the hall represent the engaging environment the user will navigate through. This bedroom presents functions such as drawers and surfaces that are extruded to create opportunities that will volunteer as furniture. The various extruded pieces on the left of the plan fall into the space that would have been the closet and instead volunteer to function as such on its own without creating the need to use foreign objects. This room, along with the other, also has apertures through the space that create moments of communication from quote-unquote room to room, along with moments of privacy through the density of the objects. These drawings show the other section of the living room that joins the living room, bedroom, and hall together, not only through the apertures made of the wallpaper, but also creates another pathway for wayfinding. And in conclusion, my thesis explores the translation of a one-sided 2D graphic surface into a double-sided 3-dimensional space, inviting the opportunities of social space, privacy, and the performed actions of domestic functions throughout the distribution of the wallpaper patterns and spatial capacities. Thank you.
Thank you, Liana. These are, I love this idea of three-dimensionalizing wallpaper. Are we to understand, if you can go back to one of the, yeah, that's fine. So the drawing on the left, is that literally a plan? When I'm looking at the key drawing, is that literally the green area in the plan?
Yes.
Okay. Can you just scroll through very?
Yes, so this is the first one.
Okay.
Hi, Liana. I'll add a kind of question. Are there any moments where these zones are not beginning or terminated by walls?
So in the home, there are no actual walls. These are kind of volunteering as such. So there are no actual solids except for these objects that are being extruded throughout the space. So that answers the question.
So you're removing the walls in the house?
Yes.
And those extruded volumes that have replaced the walls have a degree of porosity to them if I look at them straight on in elevation. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, depending on the perspective that you are looking from.
Right. But if I look at them in elevation, there are interstitial spaces between the extruded elements. Is that correct?
So if you were to look at it from elevation, it would kind of look exactly like the actual wallpaper in full. There are just moments where there's apertures made because of how far the extrusions are made.
But if the walls are no longer there and there's a gap between two of the elements,
yes.
Can I see through to the next space?
Yes.
Thank you.
Just meaning that the white space in your elevations is transparent, it's air.
Yes.
And how do you imagine these would, what's the structure of this? How would it support itself?
So believe it or not, I didn't, I wasn't, due to the different functions that I want them to perform, I would imagine that most of the objects would have various materials to them, but I haven't specified as to what type of material that they would be. I mean, as a 2D, as its original 2D, it's a very thin and, you know, paper-like material. So it would definitely be something opposite of that in order to be
But
functional.
the question was about structure, not specifically about material. So I'd love to hear your response to that question too. In other words, there must be, I mean, and if you tell me it's like not a part of the project, I'll just move on. But is there a kind of system or network of some gravity-defying material that is holding these elements in their proper place in three-dimensional space?
It wasn't defined as part of the project.
Thank you.
Also, is there you're using different colors here, and you mentioned a couple of different objects. Is there a coding as to, for instance, what the green is, or the pink, or the beige?
So each color is defined by the wallpaper, the original wallpaper. So this this process that I have shown here is the actual living room wallpaper that I showed earlier. So that's this, just in a enlarged sense.
Right, but in the extrusion as now an object, like the green, is it doing something, or is the pink a particular kind of materialization of paper? Like what is it? What are their relationships?
So it would, as I said earlier, I hadn't really specified on what materials they would be. I would just imagine that due to the specific rooms and the functions that would operate throughout the house, they would have to be, you know, a strong enough material to behold that. So the greens, for example, in this diagram are the thickest and largest pieces aside from the background material, the parts. So that would be able to hold something much larger. And so I would assume that it would be a much more heavy weighted material to be able to do that. And I would hope that not all of the pieces, like for example, here in the front where they're much thinner, that wouldn't have to be necessary for all the green pieces, but most of them that are being extruded out and are longer and are actually going to be used as a functional operative thing would have a strong material to it.
And can you, I mean, it's great, it's good for you that we're asking all these questions, but the depth of that extrusion seems to be really critical, like how you, what mechanism in the project that you developed for regulating that, or whether it's just a kind of, you know, I'm a designer and I'm going to decide how deep it needs to be. Like between those two kind of poles of understanding that question, how did you regulate the depth of the extrusions?
So as I was extruding each piece one by one, I was trying to keep in mind perspective for one, and kind of the functionality and the communicable settings that I had in mind. So thinking about which room is touching which room and how they can connect to each other, because this way there are no more doors and there are no more walls. So how can one circulate throughout the home without, or see through like to another room without a blockage or something in their way? So depending, I guess I was just kind of coordinating that within myself, using a plan drawing and such to kind of decide on how far I make the excursions. So in the back of this diagram, for example, that part is touching a wall, like the exterior wall, So that's why I went ahead and really kind of made a deeper extrusion as to the front where that part is touching another part of a wallpaper in a space. So that's why it kind of starts getting a little bit thinner and thicker, depending on functions.
And maintaining clearance for the human body in this new, Y-axis extruded world was an important consideration for you. Is that correct?
Yes, definitely.
Did you ever think about extruding in a different way than orthogonally? Like, I don't know, oblique or, diagonal, skew, like why? It looks like they're all perpendicular to the surface of the viewing surface, right?
Yeah. So
the elevation.
Yeah. The reason for that was from my very beginning of my process, I was really interested in layering and kind of dissecting and but also keeping the origin of the object. So because I started out with the original wallpaper, even though I was dissecting it and taking it into parts and creating something completely different from what it is, I didn't want it to lose touch with what it was. So I didn't want to manipulate it in a way where from a specific view, you can still see the original image of the wallpaper. But if I kind of rotated an object, or if I were to move it diagonally or scale it up, it would completely distort the image. And that's kind of not what I have planned.
I just want to talk a little bit about two things. One is are things that I think are amazing, and then the other category are things that I find like really head scratchers. So the amazing things is that it's kind of like this hallucinatory, like some of the drawings are really great. They look sort of like someone trapped in like a video game. It's kind of like this. It's got a little bit of Minecraft going on. There's a little bit of sort of Space Invaders. I probably don't know what that is, but so I don't know. I just think there's something interesting about the premise of this kind of hallucination and merging of these different pattern regimes or whatever. The head scratcher part is that like I feel like it would be really it's just really useful as a kind of engine in the project to ask it some of the difficult questions, like like the jury's been asking, like how does it stand up? Like how do the different colors signify different uses, and how can that then inform what it's doing and stuff like that. Like I feel like because I think the drawings are super cool, and I like that space, this sort of idea of the wallpaper bleeding together, I think is a really interesting premise. But you know what I mean? I just feel like the questions that are being asked, I keep thinking, yeah, tell me, and I don't think it needs to sit in this total abstraction. I think it actually could, I find it, believable enough that I would love to see, you take it to that place where there's like, okay, well, there's this place in the middle of this building. Otherwise it's conventional, but it's in the middle, right? So this core sample that we're seeing on the screen now, maybe that's in the core of the building. And it's this like insane place where these other qualities have come together, and it's this kind of, I don't know. It's this kind of third space. Anyway, I'm just throwing that out there as a sort of question. But I think the drawings are really interesting.
Yeah, Liana, could you cycle through your drawings again? I just want to add to that. I love this project, and I think you're in the territory of two of my favorite designers. One is the sculptor Rachel Whiteread, and I'll put these names in the chat box, and I really encourage you to look them up. But it's like Rachel Whiteread, who really works with solids and inverting spaces into solids. And the other person is somebody who works a lot in 2 dimensions, which is Deborah Sussman. And it's really about this idea of the super graphics. and she really only works with, or a lot of her projects really are about the paint, or the two-dimensional surface, but they're done in such a way that you feel like you're inhabiting a space through very little means. And I think that this project deserves that kind of decision. Where are you? Is this a visual sort of game that you're playing, or is it really physical, that you're inhabiting a space that has this intense variation? I think it was very smart of you to remove the walls and inhabit the spaces with these three-dimensional wallpaper. But I for one would love, more than probably any other project I've seen in the last 4 or 5 days, to see a model of this project. And I think that would force you to decide, to make some decisions about where you are in that really rich territory of graphic design to solid sculpture.
Yeah, I definitely wish I had the opportunity to create a model as well.
It's interesting because that's precisely where you started.
Exactly.
I'd add too, just in terms of there's what you produced, and then perhaps it's always interesting to ask what does the project itself produce. I would be really interested to see, for example, the drawing that's on the right side of the screen that we're seeing right now, which is an elevation, correct?
It's a section, yes.
That's a section with an elevation behind it?
Yes.
It'd be wonderful to see the extruded colored elements of the wallpaper matted out, and to see what we would see of the space behind it through the interstitial spaces. So I'm anticipating that would be an incredibly intricate and powerful kind of figure ground moment in this project. It seems like it's like one of those third things that all your operations would produce that I'm very curious about. I think also that just in a more obvious way, if the spaces have been, I don't quite know else how to say this, but constrained to allow for the human body to pass through them, which I think the Rachel Whiteread projects do not, which is sort of an interesting contrast between what we've done and that sculptor's work. Then the imprint, how that imprint of the human body and how the project has kind of had a trail cleared through itself. I'm interested in that process. I'd love to see more of how you did that.
I agree with a lot of that as well. The notion that you would activate a view or activate the viewer. I think just to kind of zoom out, the premise of the project is really interesting and super relevant, I think. Just basically the notion of surface to volume, which is an exercise that we engage in architecture and in design all the time, right? I mean, we're consistently thinking about how to maybe build depth or volume to things that might be flat. So I guess having said that, I feel like you've come to a kind of formulaic or a point of where you have a framework, and I would really love for you to be able to deploy that formula or that framework in a much more pointed or specific way in order to achieve, like, to be able to demonstrate I can do this with it and I can do that with it, and that it's not always, the feedback isn't always what you get from the formula, but you really start to swerve and control what a formula can give you, which I think you're poised to do that. I wouldn't stop there, and I wouldn't take what you've gotten for granted, and I would hope you'd keep working on it, because I do think that if you fed different parameters into the formula, you might come up with really interesting ways to make it more tectonic, or to be able to activate the viewer, as was mentioned, and is really interesting for me too, because I think, being able to recall the original pattern you started with is wonderful, but then deriving different patterns through the notion that your formula would impact these extrusions would be incredibly exciting as a kind of spatial kind of mandate.
So there's something really fascinating about inhabiting this kind of the kind of negative space, right? Basically the air. And it seems like there's a kind of clearing that happens for specific zones of the house. And I think there's something really kind of interesting if we start thinking about, since there's no walls, right? That there might be different ways to move through the house that is not necessarily prescribed by this original plan. That is like, well, I can perhaps like move through a kind of like clearing that allows me to kind of climb into a space where I'm no longer orthogonal to any particular plane, right? And also there's this notion of like responding to the body as is there another way to inhabit these different spaces now with, let's say, some sense of its original program, but now reconsidered through this process. You know, how would it be if we are, let's say, in the kitchen cooking like upside down or something, right? So I think there might be a really interesting way to think about that kind of human relationship to the program and how you generated these volumes. But it's also like there's something really kind of funky. Like if like I can think about the senses being at play, not just the visual, but like what you can smell, what you can like hear, right? And kind of how that, even like how sound could echo through the space, could be pretty interesting. So I concur with a lot of the comments in terms of like you do have a sense of order in which you're making decisions, and perhaps those decisions could begin to structure the actual structure, but also to structure the activity. And in that respect, how does it radicalize, you know, this this house, right? Where living room is no longer the living room, or et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just thinking that in some ways, the logic of what you have here is not that different than a hypostyle hall. Do you know what a hypostyle hall is, Liana? So it's a building typology that comes from ancient Egypt. It's essentially a kind of, well, it's not a basilica, but it's a space that is essentially, it's full of columns, and there's more mass than void. Okay. Right? So there's more kind of material than space. And they're really curious because they really push against program to a certain extent. They're spaces of circulation, but they're hard to kind of occupy otherwise, right? And so you almost have like a hypostyle hall that's been sort of miniaturized because the elements are quite diminutive, and then you've turned it 90 degrees so that it's horizontal rather than vertical, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that you're kind of on the precipice right now of developing new spatial typologies that might exist independent of program. Like it's not, I don't think you could live in this house as a conventional 1940s house anymore. It would actually demand some kind of programmatic accommodation or some kind of new emergent way of occupying space. Right? Definitely. Yeah. And I think that might be one of the next steps in what you could potentially do here. Any last comments for Liana?
The model of this project, for your portfolio, probably, I think it would be really fantastic to have.
Okay. Definitely a summer project I should have in mind.
Yeah, I agree. When you can get back into physical resources again, it's worth doing. It's definitely worth doing.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Liana. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Congrats. All right. So next we have Athar. Athar is one of our master's students.
Hello everyone, my name is Athar Said. During my past year, I tried to address the lack of admission in certain interiors. Interiority sometimes can be inadmissible for cultural, political, or religious reasons, or sometimes spaces cannot exist anymore. Technology can support us to gain visual ingress to any hidden spaces by applying imaging methods. I believe that the birth of augmented reality is the key to give every individual equal right to experience and access off-limit interiors. Al-Kaaba, the center of the Islamic religion, is a strong subject of an inaccessible space, which is located in the city of Mecca. There are 1 billion Muslims around the world, which is 24% of the world population. Every year, only 2.5 million will have the chance to visit the Kaaba when the pilgrimage month comes. According to the Islamic law, only Muslims have religious access to the holy site, even though the interior of the Kaaba is restricted to the guardian of the house twice a year, which they are few numbers, maybe 10 or less. I propose a temporary design exhibition to experience the admission and interiors in the interior of the Kaaba. The project will take place at the National Building Museum in Washington, D.C., circling the Kaaba 7 times counterclockwise. It's the essential act when Muslims visit the holy site. The circulation path and the design exhibition inspired by this act. So the exhibition divided in 3 main parts. Every part controlled 2 circles, including the mezzanine circle. 4,000 years ago, the Kaaba placed in 45 degrees, which create a symmetrical axis for the holy site. Sustaining the same orientation in the National Museum measure the idea of how we visualize and exhibit the architecture itself, exposing the visitor to several types of experience, starting with original historical parts, moving on to the physical form and the ultimate AR overlay, going up to the mezzanine level for close-up, and finalize the tour with the documentary shows. In general, all the drawings are ignored in museum archives. This is the oldest drawing of the Kaaba in the 15th century. Design transition points. By imprinting drawing in the whole way through the exhibition path as a barcode, so the visitor can simply enjoy the design with or without the AR overlay. Original historical parts are fragments from the interior, the exterior, the surrounding of the Kaaba. The historical parts tell a real story since the layout adopt the same roots. For example, the history addressed that the Kaaba had 2 parallel doors, as you can see, and now it is only 1 door. The exhibition tour starts with the black stone, acknowledging that the black stone is the starting point for circling the Kaaba in the real life. Architectural drawings always protect the history of any building. As a transition point, after visitors complete the historical parts exhibit, they will observe a new imprint drawing with the AR here, moving forward to the physical form exhibit from this side. There are some restrictions to create an actual scale mock-up of the Kaaba, which lead to design challenge. Extracting the initial shape of the Kaaba helped to generate the physical form and applying the AR layer of the interior. It's always start with the black stone. The visitor will get the chance to circle the exterior of the physical form, going up to the interior by a small lift in the back. The lift in the back can hold three people maximum, or one wheelchair at once. According to the Quran narrative, Zamzam water exists before the Kaaba itself. In the 19th century, Domingo was the first scholar who pretended to be Muslim just to study the Islamic architect. Moving on in the circulation path and observe the Zamzam wall and the old staircase. Domingo delivered a scale plan of the holy site, and this is considered the first clear plan of the Kaaba. And you can see here the 45-degree, and the Kaaba walls are not parallel. Going up to the mezzanine level to witness a new angle of the physical form and applying the AR overlay of the interior. The interior has a 3 wooden columns, a chest, a sign spot where Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, used to pray here, a marble, a green woven silk in the upper wall and ceiling. The interior walls show 10 memorial letters from the Islamic leaders who served the God house through history. Moving forward to the mezzanine level, addressing the golden scupper in a way as it is still discharging the rainwater from the Kaaba roof. Al-Kiswa is the black cover of the Kaaba exterior, an old tradition from Muslims to honor the God house, which is discharged every year. It is 4 sides with the golden embroidery, including the curtain of the Kaaba door. Domingo captured the Kiswa tradition on the pilgrimage month. On the left side, the old Kiswa raised on the beginning of the pilgrimage month. On the right side, the new Kiswa placed and the Kaaba door opened after the pilgrimage end. It is remarkable how the narrative of an architecture piece can evolve through time with the same principle. Reforming architecture with an unusual viewpoint, hanging the discharge Kiswa of the last year on the last 2 circles of the exhibition. The visitor interact with some process samples from the Kiswa factory. The Kiswa factory worked all year to submit a new cover for the next year, overlaying AR documentaries about the Kiswa factory and the Kaaba history timeline. The Ottoman Empire received the holy site until the early of the 20th century, and the facade is still existing in the Holy Mosque until today. Showing full-size scale of the Kaaba, the black silk, the gold and silver threads and on the embroidery design, which is messages from the Holy Quran. After the visitor witnessed the Kaaba door curtain, they simply finished the exhibition tour. During this semester, I got the chance to join a mixed reality class to have a better understanding of the AR technology. I built inside the Kaaba AR demo to support the thesis investigation. We all know that AR is still in the early stages. Nevertheless, the exhibition proposal will support oncoming AR technology in the far future, such as the contact lenses or small bin in your clothes. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for that. It's really, really interesting. Just a question, just for clarification for me, is that when you enter this exhibition, is the concept of the display that it is a hybrid recreation of the original artifact, so that parts of it are physical and then parts of it are augmented? Or is it, I mean, and that they're sort of intact spatially? Or, okay, so here it's, okay. So we see it's sort of kind of broken apart. Is that correct? So this,
yes. It's
okay.
Three main parts. In the middle, the actual original pieces from the Kaaba, the interior, the exterior, and the surrounding of the Kaaba.
I see. So just so I understand, so if you're on the right side where you're looking at the sort of foundation, the augmented reality creates the surrounding, like it creates the environment around it.
Yes.
And then when you're on, let's say, on the left side of this image here, okay, so then on the left side of this image here where we see a physical recreation of the exterior, the augmented reality creates, I guess, the interior that you can see, or, you know, I'm just trying to think about how, are they all the same three, like, for example, it's, you can sort of see three sections. So there's, you know, the left and the middle and the top right. And they're all essentially recreations of the Kaaba, but one of them has the exterior physical, the middle one has the interior elements that are physical, and the right one has the, I guess, the foundation that's physical. Is that, am I understanding that correctly? So it's kind of recreated three separate times, but with different parts being physical.
You can think about it as the layer onions. So there is some restriction in the Islamic law to make a full scale of the Kaaba. So now I have just the physical form, which is the white one here. And when you pass through, you can see the exterior of the Kaaba. So you can see it with your phone, or maybe in the future with your lenses.
Right.
Then you can go inside with the lift to see the interior. In the middle, you will start with the middle to see actual pieces from the Kaaba. It's already there in the exhibition. And when you go to the last two circles here, it's the discharge kiswa from last year. So it's the real kiswa. So every year they discharge the kiswa and give it gifts for museums.
I see.
So I will bring it to the exhibition.
I see, okay. And so is it only the area on the right-hand side that uses the augmented reality, or do all three use that?
So when you walk through, you will see some drawings. The drawings will be imprinted in the black, like in here. And you can see the drawings through the AR layer. And when you walk through, you will see drawings between the hallways. So when you exit one section to the other, you can see some drawings.
This is an incredibly beautiful presentation. Thank you. I feel like I actually learned a lot about the history also. I have a question for you. My understanding of the pilgrimage is that there's a ritual involved. You circle 7 times, is that right? Around the Kaaba when you go on the pilgrimage. Do you are you replicating any part of that ritual as well?
So I take the act, which is, so usually even if you visit the holy site in non-pilgrimage month, so there is the small pilgrimage, you can do it daily, all the year, and in the pilgrimage month is the big pilgrimage. It's in the Hajj month. You do it once. You can circle the Kaaba, even if you visit for any prayer. So here in the Kaaba calendar, I try to study the 2020 year. I don't know that the coronavirus, it will happen and it will be different. So when you see here, it's more darker. It's in the pilgrimage month. Muslims, they arrive more to the Kaaba. And in Ramadan months, which is now in May, there are more visitors.
And how much of this are you replicating then in your project?
My focus on how to engrass the interior, because now it is impossible. So actually my grandma bragged about she went to inside the Kaaba when she was 10 years old. So now it's impossible to go inside. It's just for the guardian of the house when they are required to go inside. They go first in Ramadan, before Ramadan, to prepare the house for the guests, the worship guests, and in the pilgrimage month, in the beginning of the pilgrimage month.
Thank you, that helps.
Hi, Aitar. Thank you for the presentation. I'll say I agree with Ingmalil. Some of the drawings are really beautiful. Your drawings, as well as the historic drawings you found and shared, are really very cool. Thanks for that. I would also say I always admire students who take on a deeply personal project for a thesis, because I think it's really hard to be objective about working on a project like that, and both, talking and sort of delivering a project of that nature. There's a lot that I read into the project that I want to share with you, and I guess I'll preface some of these things by saying that, well, let me kind of tell you what I read into the project. Obviously, the literal versus digital, which Tim asked about, and I concur. Like, I think maybe I'm reading into his questions as well, but from my point of view, it would be really interesting if we could, sort of overtly understand what is literally physically there and what is sort of digitally or, virtually projected. So maybe a series of diagrams to explicate that even more specifically. And then I think your project deals with procession, so like architectural promenade, and obviously the original kind of pilgrimage deals with procession. It's a very important part of it. Your project deals with, as I mentioned, literal versus digital, parts to whole, because you're bringing in parts that are meant to represent the whole. So how do you do that? Maybe sidedness, because you're sort of revealing sides of parts that wouldn't necessarily be revealed in the way that they are in your exhibition. I guess all this to say that these are really profound kind of discussion points and dialogues in pedagogy that we can have in architecture. that are embedded in what you just shared with us. And I'm sure you've been talking about all of this with Heather, the entire year and thinking about it. But I really wish you had foregrounded these conversations in the presentation. Like, I think I understand the need to try and kind of walk us through exactly what happens in the pilgrimage so that we understand how the exhibition functions. I think that's super important. I would find also time to plug in how you're sort of engaging with these maybe larger architectural conversations so that you can invite an even larger audience into participating in the discussion with you.
I would just add, I think it's really, just to really dogpile, it's a really superb, wonderful, hats off kind of thesis project, and I really want to congratulate you on producing, a piece of work to kind of finish your graduate studies that's of this order. I think just a couple things I could add to, I think, some really good criticism we've already gotten is one, I think that this is, as you have it, I don't think the way that you've integrated the exhibition design of this into the space of the National Building Museum, I think is both really thorough, but I would also add, I think it's really hardwired to that building. And I mean that in a good way, but I think it's kind of a fact. And I love seeing being able to read the scale of your two walls, which are exactly the right size, right? Against the scale of those Corinthian columns. I mean, just as a kind of measure, which leads me into what I think, for me personally, is just one of the most interesting things about your project. And again, I couldn't agree more. I would love it if you made this an explicit part of the text of the project myself. Too, is this need that we're both physical and spiritual beings, so your project is going to make me get all kind of a little outside the boundaries of architectural criticism, but we're both physical and spiritual beings, and I think one of the most compelling things about our lives is this gap between our spiritual lives and our physical beings. And I think your project really, really kind of examines that boundary, both through the kind of physical recreation of these artifacts and through the augmented reality kind of veneering of them. And it's one that's always fascinated me when I visit sacred sites around the world. And this idea of how if I just examine the physicality of that sacred artifact enough, would I somehow get closer to its spiritual content? And it's a really interesting struggle, I think. It's a very human struggle, and it's one that transcends all religions and all spiritual practice. And I think I'm so excited to see a project that makes me say these words. So thanks.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, this I similarly, I really appreciate that it's a project that one I learned a lot from, but also I really appreciate thinking about the layers of interiority and exteriority, and I say that mainly through both the content and what you have designed as the exhibition experience. So there is I think the kind of the building itself that you're the cover and the physicality and what is understood as the layers of history that builds that culture, and so how one begins to understand that, right? And the kind of it's not it is a very carefully calibrated kind of movement and experience, and I almost want to, in a similar way, the earlier question of both understanding the physical and the virtual relationships and what that experience is that I like to understand there is a procession, but that procession is in part directing an experience that in a secular space that we can understand this religion much more in depth, and how you bring us through that. And so in that respect, I think there is even the siting within this building, I think as a way of, you're talking about, moving through, but then that you get onto the upper level and you encounter the architecture and the artifacts in a very different way, right? Exactly. And so I think there's something about both the device of putting oneself in a space, putting oneself in a space virtually and imaginatively, and also then putting oneself being literally in contact with something, right? So I almost wish maybe there's a way to talk about those distances as part of this experience, and or as part of the exhibition experience as well. Do you see what I mean? That there's a parallel relationship, and as both being able to go inside and go outside. And I think it's very timely that this year, obviously, you can't go to this pilgrimage. So where this actually becomes a moment that allows people to actually enter in, I think would be really interesting as a way to talk about that.
So let me add some more accolades and congratulations. This is such a beautiful project, and I'll tell you why I think this is such an incredible project. You've taken a very complex, deeply historical sort of circumstance, right? Or set of circumstances. There's the artifact, there's the, as Mitchell said, the spirituality, and you come up with a design that's so elegant and so, it seems so inevitable, your design, that it makes so much sense as you walk us through the project. And what you see is, at times you see a singular element, and at other times you see the assemblage, right? So there's the simple, and then there's the complex, and it oscillates between those two. And it makes for this amazing experience that ties together this, historical artifact with contemporary technology. And I think that you've done that really incredibly beautifully. I think the black and white graphic on the ground is so elegant. You're changing very subtly levels, if I understood that correctly, on the ground plane. And that, which means that you're changing the level at which the body confronts the artifacts. There are so many elements to this that I think, as I said, I feel like it's deceptively simple and incredibly powerful and very inevitable. There's one project, and while it's simpler than this, I don't know if you've seen Christoph's presentation about the Berlin Wall project. It's worth looking at also, because it also, in a way, I would love to see this built and developed as a project. And I think that the world needs projects like this. And I just wanted to congratulate you for doing something so beautiful.
Thank you.
I just want to chime in just quickly on something that I appreciate about the renderings is as Ingalill suggested, is this use of the kind of this kind of strong graphic that is the pathway, right? And then there's the sort of non-material, almost like props that represent just a volume of something that's been recreated by the museum. And then there's the full color reality of the real artifacts. And I would just sort of say, as you know, if you were to develop this or if you were to really build it, I think what would be really interesting is to actually amplify those differences perhaps even further. Like I would actually love to see how the augmented reality experience is one that is equally designed. That is to say, you have graphical dimensions within that, which are, let's say, editorial, right? They could be the voice of the museum, but they're shown in a way that, let's say, uses the same visual vocabulary as the markings on the floor, for example, you know, or it's just to sort of run with this the choice you made, which I think is good, to have a limited palette, right? Actually to say, okay, it's got the graphic language, I've got the solid language, and I've got the real thing. And then to build on that more. Like, for example, on the ground, I almost think there could be more changes in level, where you physically kind of go up and down, that it's using the building as an interface in that way, which actually you have by having the mezzanine employed to view the architecture at different levels. But I just think it would be fun to kind of build on that even further. And yeah.
Thank you.
One weird detail just to point out, knowing that building, is the those columns are brick, so they're very first of all, they're very unusual columns, the original columns that are in the Architecture Museum, and it would make, I mean, I'm just saying that it would be a very different image if we sort of see the brickness of those columns, and to sort of figure out how to reconcile that with the neutrality of the other architecture.
Any last columns? Any last columns? Any last comments for Athar? Great. Congratulations, Athar.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
And boy, what a difference a day makes, right?
Mm-hmm.
They did a dress rehearsal presentation to me Friday.
Okay.
And it was, the visuals were all there. The verbal was, struggling. But today was flawless. You did so well.
Thank you.
Congratulations. Okay. We've reached our caboose. So Ryan is going to bring the house down here at the end, I think.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Just want to be sure. Let me share my screen. Okay, can you guys see them?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Ryan. So my thesis project, titled The Syntax of Collapse, explores the visual collapsing of milieu in a domestic setting through apertures and material effects to create program alignments that are precisely arranged and framed, whereby an interior condition is assembled through visual participation. It reconciles intimate moments with the public settings of a home and reconsiders what it means to conventionally dwell. The alignment of apertures creates a disruption in the way we live and confronts our perception of privacy. So I began with studying the Barcelona Pavilion by Mies van der Rohe and Willy Reich for the material effects its stone, marble, water, and glass has on spatial boundaries. The use of water collapses the movement of the sky onto its surface and also picks up the patterning of travertine underneath, becoming a two-sided condition. The veined surfaces of polished marble collate reflections of the surrounding landscape and are then mirrored and expanded in the shallow pools of water. The specificity of the material choice in color and finish creates a visual and spatial ambiguity. The visual texture and color of the green stone
with the reflection of foliage in the adjacent trees make the wall appear to move. And the texture and color of the red onyx wall is amplified by the velvet curtains map onto its surface through reflection. So I also looked at The Large Glass by Marcel Duchamp. The transparency of the glass plane gathers and collapses content behind and in front of its surface. This pulls objects far away into the foreground and looks at the notion of distance with a single aperture framing the view. And so a quote from George Tissot reads, "Architecture is thus transformed into a device that participates in this staging of an ecstasy. Given this novel situation, an architectural design no longer simply leads to something to look at, such an object or building, but rather becomes an apparatus that allows the view, that is the user, to behold something other than the thing itself." So with the project, I began with a generative process of collage as an experimental design methodology. I explored atmosphere and conditions of space in terms of scale, perspective, detail, textile, texture, and aperture. And so with regard to the use of aperture, George Tissot also said, "Any threshold or marginal zone induces a reciprocal state. It looks two ways at once." And so beginning with the entry of the home, a single peephole in the heavy patina door becomes a display window for interchangeable objects. The threshold of a large heavy door is contrasted with a small delicate portal into the home. Openings for a dining table and shoes align with the table surfaces and foot placement once seated. The presence of the home's accessories give a sense of occupancy without the occupant actually being seen. A fire from the living room dances on the polished marble table as a meal is enjoyed. Fireplaces aren't typically seen through, and by placing it within an interior wall, you gain the ability to make it two-sided. Above, a provocative view opens up to an upstairs bathroom. Reflections of the sky above collapse onto the dining table, the bathtub, and water. From the point of view of someone seated at the dining table, the distinct massive opening reveals only a small body part. Similar to the effects of the Barcelona Pavilion, the veining in the black marble and its polished surface creates a liveliness to the sky and clouds reflected onto it. The dining table becomes fully alive with food, fire, and sky from the surrounding conditions. The living room is set as a social place of entertainment and spectacle. The sheer curtains silhouette the various articles of clothing in the closet placed on the other side, becoming evocative imagery of form, color, and the body changing, and also suggesting an animation of bodies. And so the flames of the fireplace glow through the curtains and underneath the seams of textiles. Oftentimes, the kitchen is referred to as the heart of the home. To cook and prepare food is a shared experience and nourishes the body and soul. Views of the bath and shower reveal intimate moments of cleansing. From the kitchen side through the lower slot, the body soaking in the tub is understood as a bust. Meanwhile, if you're standing in the shower, you're able to see the counter surface and food prep through the upper slot. From the desk, a body can be seen in bed and is framed to become an abstract image in its positioning of bending, folding, and curling. In the bedroom, contemplation can be seen and felt in the study. The closet's clothes hang in solitude, contrasting with the textile of the drapes. Views of the body constantly change through the study's aperture. The clothes get pulled to the area of concentration and have a soft backdrop from the drapes. And so the overall axon reveals a linear organization of spaces welded by interstitial apertures that frame and collapse conditions within the house in both directions. The project challenges the dominant methodology of designing spaces from analytical conception to experiential production, engaging in representational techniques that prioritize interiority and experiential conditions of atmosphere and occupation over quantifiable logics. Typically, apertures frame views to the outside. The apertures I've created in the home, except for the peephole and the skylight above the dining table, establish views that collapse one interior space upon another. This change in connection intensifies the tension within the home. I've employed optical collapse of reflection and materiality, like the Barcelona Pavilion, through the horizontal surfaces. The marble's reflectivity, irregularity, and texture ask for it to be an animated surface with human actions and environmental conditions, blurring the drifting clouds in the sky, amplifying the warm hues from a fire, and placing a body on the surface. The large glasses' qualities of double-sidedness and pairing of foreground and background become critical and is applied as a vertical condition of the spaces. Within a home, there's an ephemeral relationship between humans, space, texture, and shape. It's an impermanent experience in a static space. The apertures let the activities of context and occupation map themselves onto the material conditions of the surfaces, and the arrangement of apertures collapse the spatial narratives of the home. Thank you.
That was incredible, Leanne, just absolutely sublime. Can you, I wish I could see the drawings in person because I would want to savor them. Can you maybe scroll through them again?
Sure.
Slowly so we can enjoy them.
Sure, let me start, get back to the beginning of the project area. Would you like to see of the actual home or with the progressive kind of collages?
From the beginning.
Oh.
I don't know.
Out of it.
Okay. Let me know if I'm going too fast.
Can I blather on while you're going through these?
Of course, yeah.
Okay. I just want to say, yeah, like in this time of us being holed up, like in our houses, I think this kind of intense meditation on the potentials of an interior experience are really, moving. I mean, I think it's really, it's a beautiful, beautiful project, and obviously the representations themselves are a thing in and of themselves. They're really beautiful, but I also I guess I just want to say that, I don't know. I guess it's still sort of new to me for all of us to have this situation of being, quarantined or whatever, but in some different degrees. And I'm just saying that I think that the conversation surrounding this degree of intentionality in interrogating our interior existence is just means something different now than it did just a few months ago, and I just really appreciate it. I think it's really it's kind of like fresh again. It's like a new. It has new meaning, and and like if you imagine living in this amazing building, going to Zoom meetings like all of us and stuff like that, somehow, I don't know. I think those are relevant things to throw into the mix. That is to say that this is architecture pushing back and finding a way to reassert the real in a realm that now has been kind of like pushed around by media. You know what I mean? We're at home, and it's no longer a refuge. It's kind of like a place where the world is pouring in, through all these portals, of media, and the idea that that the architecture is reasserting its perceptual chops, is just an interesting reframing or interesting reassertion or reminder or whatever you want to say. And I just really appreciate it. There's so many little details to talk about, but I just, as a larger point, I just wanted to, kind of appreciate what this means now.
Thank you.
There's a kind of really, Tim, you and I are getting to the point where we can talk about where life choices led us instead of where we hope to be. I've made some life choices where I live in an incredibly kind of minimal housing condition, a really banal, minimal housing condition, but I live in a place where I use the space around where I live as a big part of my nourishment or my environment that I get from my environment. I'm not getting that anymore. And so now I look at my friends who really invested in their homes as homes instead of just a place to like eat and sleep before you go outside again. And I look at them with some jealousy right now and some regret maybe about my own choices. And so I want to, I think it's, I couldn't agree more with Tim's criticism front to back, but I think I'd also add that there's a kind of question both of a word other than nourishment, a kind of mental health and living a full question of how to live a full life now. And the premises for that, as Tim says, have shifted. And so I think this project really does plug into that dialogue in such a serious and sensual way. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah, I concur. I mean, I've been taking notes and I wrote lovely images. So I mean, but it's actually more than that they're lovely images. I found the precision in them to be really, really compelling, both in terms of the transects. Obviously, we're sort of maybe more prone to precision when it comes to more structured drawings, but also the precision in the kind of details, the small sort of sample details that you had. I don't know, I guess in sort of trying to represent projects these days, sometimes we invest so heavily in atmospherics that are not sort of reflected in a kind of rigorous exploratory phase of the project and are just kind of a byproduct of like representing them at the very last moment. But I think yours are absolutely invested in what's been investigated throughout. That I just found the kind of zoomed in details you started with in terms of the kind of list you were going through, like perspective, detail, textile, and whatnot, to be really precise. And I really appreciate that. Yeah, I don't know. I concur with a lot of the comments ahead of me. It's really nice to see. It was also really nice to hear you talk about the project through such precision.
Thank you.
Ditto for all those comments. And the imageries are absolutely amazing. So this particular drawing feels like much more of this index of what you've kind of designed, right? In this kind of choreographed spatial sequence. And I come back to your description of the Barcelona Pavilion, in what it's exposing through the materiality, a kind of like mirroring and overlay and other kinds of like activated materiality through the reflection and stuff. There's also a sense of movement through the kind of physical movement through the Barcelona Pavilion that is, it's actually also incredibly precise. So there's a kind of circular or radial way of moving through. There's also like a tracking. There's a hidden kind of skylight that is essentially the kind of it's hidden in a way that it forces you to sort of like really have to think about where the center of that space is. And so in looking at the last image of your of the kind of collage of all the spaces together, I'm looking at that and I'm looking for a way to track. Because I like everything about your decisions of like how you move from one space, but then maybe adjacent to it, there's another view that all of a sudden gives a glimpse into the other space. I'm looking for a way to perhaps track, like if there is no center, it's one thing, but I do wonder how, if as a home or as a space of a home, how one begins to track I'm not so sure if it's a center here. I'm not so sure what it is that one might track, but there is something about the laying out right now of this like one sequence after another that I wonder if they begin to inflect, let's say from the fireplace to the entry, for instance, like you begin to understand those, for lack of a better word, distances, as a way of developing the kind of memory and that experience. Because like everything about this project is like absolutely beautiful, and but I don't know if it's just episodic. I think there's a little bit more than just the kind of episodic appearances of images. There's a kind of building up. And in that building up, I wonder what that tracking might be. So do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so in terms of, I guess, like going back to your point in terms of that clear kind of navigation through the Barcelona Pavilion, it came up as, you know, this is like kind of being the big reveal of those episodic moments of what you're referring to. And I think it dives into a conversation of what order and how you're circulating throughout the home to reveal and see these moments. Because I don't show a clear kind of path of circulation or center, as you're saying. And so you start to wonder how something so linear, I think, becomes a moment that you enter into, and what that kind of threshold means. And in terms of like, I think the term episodic, it's not so much knowing that specific distance, but understanding the sense of what it's creating, or the kind of fleeting moment that's happening within the space. For example, let me just scroll back. Like you take it for this example, if you just look at the dining table and imagine that the sky is moving above, and then there's fire and the flames, you know, engulfing like the side of the edge of the table, it's more of that, let's say, transient moment, not so much about knowing the specific distance, but understanding that is nearby in its proximity, if that is answering or addressing the question. But those are all the thoughts that I had in my head as I was listening to you and what you were commenting.
No, that does help to sort of understand this a little bit better. It's almost I know that this wasn't just about affect, but the experiences actually is what you're alluding to as part of memory and as a way of tracking. So I appreciate how you talk about it. Thank you.
Ryan, could you go back to your last drawing, your long axon? Sure. I think one of the things that I've been thinking about in general this whole day is this strange conversation that as interior architecture students and as faculty that teaches in interior architecture, we always have to kind of defend and explain, which is how we are distinct from architecture and how what we do is distinct, right? Or at least that question is always thrust upon us, and we always have to develop some kind of a response, right? Sometimes it's a defensive posture, sometimes it's submission, sometimes it's sort of like, what, right? And I think one of the things that you've done here, which puts your kind of dagger like square in the heart of that question, is that you have taken the dominant design methodology of architecture, which is to start with the analytical. Typically, almost all architecture studios these days start with the diagrammatic, and they work their way increasingly toward things that have measure, materiality, tectonic, atmosphere, and affect, right? And you've inverted the whole thing. You started with a very clear sense of space and scale and atmosphere and occupation, and the diagrammatic, the analytical came at the end as a way to expose the work that you had done. And I think that as a kind of lesson, not only for yourself, but as a kind of offering to the discipline, is a huge gift. And I also think that what has resulted as a consequence of it is a full-fledged project that is really resolved and has no architecture, meaning it's organs without a body. It doesn't have an outside, right? And I think if you put this in front of a lot of, well, maybe not everyone, but in front of certain kinds of people, it would make them deeply uncomfortable for precisely that reason. And I think that's a kind of amazing place to find yourself.
Let me add to that, and also something Narine said earlier. I don't believe something can be beautiful unless it's also precise. And I think I'm so glad that your presentation was recorded, because I think it was interesting to hear Heather, because she obviously knows your process and how you developed the project. But the way you presented it, you were able to use words to help us understand your project, and words matter. And your ability to articulate the intention and then so clearly give us those words you use: scale, perspective, detail, textile, texture, aperture. It was so clear to understand what your intention was. And then voila, there it was, the thing that you were describing. And I think it's that, I think so many projects miss because people, designers, don't appreciate that the act of writing and thinking is such a vital part of designing clearly. And I think that is one of the beautiful things about this project. I think it's also fascinating to see this after the project we just saw, Ithar's project, because there's a procession, there's this ritual procession through this project that echoes what we just saw, has the spiritual quality to it. And yet this is the private domestic. And I think that those two projects speak so eloquently together. And I think it was just a really beautiful kind of crescendo to come to those two projects at the end of this beautiful day.
Thank you.
For me, also, one very interesting aspect of this project is that, since we're all now in these different circumstances, at home, working through Zoom, communicating, I've seen many people struggle with living in an open floor plan, basically. In the now for 100 years, we architects celebrated the plan libre, and made that a fetish. And now all of a sudden we're reaching a point where it's not functional anymore for us, and we're starting to question modernity in general through that. And so, and I see in your project a potential to look for a new kind of domesticity that is not the open floor plan anymore, but it is also not the classic Victorian enfilade or something like that. It's a new way of living in an interior that, on one hand, has the connectivity between the different um, spaces and between the different activities, but only through small glimpses instead of the full um, open connection between them. I think that makes me very happy that there might be hope for us as designers to come up with new ways of living. So thank you for that.
Well, just to chime in on that a little bit too, because I've been looking at this drawing here, and there's something really dreamlike. It reminds me of Goodnight Moon a little bit in terms of like this kind of childlike confusion of scale in this way where it's like if you look at the size of a person as scaled on the living room chairs, right? And you imagine that person standing next to the shower curtain, it's like a 30-foot shower curtain. And there's this incredible, almost urban scale, like it's a theatrical scale, you know? It's like I don't know, I'm just saying that I think there's something amazing about that. Like, it's like, I can't, you know, so there's all of these things that register in a familiar way, and then you kind of look at them more closely and you realize some of these distances are pretty large, and some of the scales. Anyway, I'm just saying that I quite liked Heather's analysis of this kind of inversion of the process, and just to maybe invert it even further, it's like instead of beginning at the experience, it's like beginning in your dreams, you know. Like I don't know, that's just interesting. It also kind of, it's funny because if you think of it as kind of part of a continuum, let's say, that ends with the city and starts with, in that same sequence, let's say with your dreams, it does kind of have this empowering concept, not unlike set design, where you create a provisional universe. You know, here the idea of like having a proscenium scaled, you know, shower next to these diminutive. I'm trying to sort of expand that the implications of that inversion that Heather sort of started with, like, you know, so yes, if you start with the imagination, what's on the other end of that sequence, right? So if in the conventions of an architectural process you conclude with the detail, what's on the other side of this process?
Maybe coming back to your question, it's kind of interesting to think about Étant-Donné as part of the precedent. There is an aspect of entering into another world, and that world is as much defining both the kind of mundane of our perspectival world into another world that is not necessarily governed by perspective, or perhaps by scale, or perhaps by linearity, the way that we would normally think about diagramming. So there's something really kind of like appropriate in bringing Étant-Donné into the discussion of this project. So yeah, I also thought about that shower curtain. It's like, wouldn't it be amazing to shower in there? You know, and it's just like your project makes in reflecting about my own space right now just really boring. So thank you for the moment of delight in thinking about how to inhabit.
I also think there's these amazing drawings. I forget exactly when they were done, early to mid-century in Germany. I think it was Adolf Appia who did these sort of set designs, and they're these beautiful sort of cascading stairs. And they were a kind of provocation about trying to incite a new form of dance. So the idea that the kind of architectural apparatus or the kind of physical stagecraft could incite a new pattern of movement or a new kind of programmatic agenda. And I sort of feel like the yeast for all of that is here, because some of these spaces are really quite odd. And I mean that in a good way. Like, you come through this massive door. I don't know what the actual metrics of it are, but it's pretty damn big. And then you have this very elongated split space, right? And then the space between the desk and the closet is something magnitudes more than generous, right? And so it sort of asks for a different way of thinking about what an interior domestic life might be. And it's not purely just a scale thing. It's not that these spaces are kind of triple extra large. A lot of it's their proportion. A lot of it's the way that they're anchored by very, very small, subtle details, right? Like you hold the whole world down with like a thumbtack, you know, sort of has that sensibility to it. And I think that there's a lot of years of unpacking that could be done, even just with what's implied in this one drawing.
Mm-hmm. I really like, as you're talking, Heather, I'm thinking like I really love that there's a kind of lack of anxiety at letting these moments or these vignettes that you've designed kind of start to collide. And I think that's because it really is truly because the project is rooted in a way of working from the inside out as opposed to from the outside in. And I'm not sure that, you know, we teach sort of conventional architectural studios that way, or that we even, most of us are comfortable in designing that way. But there's this really interesting interesting kind of mismatch of moments that start to happen as these vignettes are brought together, and each one has its own like constraints, because you want to foster a particular sort of apparatus within that vignette, and then it comes together with one that's proportioned and scaled in an entirely different way. And the kind of resistance to try to make things fit in a kind of fluid, uncelebratory or unmarked way kind of is pretty great. I hope you sort of take stock that this is like a sort of byproduct of what you've had or what you've gotten in this drawing. I'm sure it was a deliberate decision, but I think that that's a kind of interesting, I think that's an interesting place to be.
I just add too that you know it's incredibly effective at kind of subverting its own language to new purposes. So it's taking a kind of, you know, at first it's a somewhat familiar language of, you know, kind of, you know, wood and minimal mineral surface interior vocabulary. And I think through all the things that have been described, I think really, you know, precisely here, it takes that language and it forces it into a kind of new kind of relevance. You're saying new things with it through these kind of moments of subversive abnormality that you've created using that language. And I think that's a pretty high bar to get over for senior project. Really, it's a wonderful piece of work, Brianna.
Thank you. So maybe it's maybe not entirely a happy accident that Mitchell's here on the afternoon jury, because Mitchell does these things on his reviews, and I'll be privy to it tomorrow, that I have always loved, and he's one of the few people I know who's brave enough to do it, which is that he always manages somehow to kind of expose the scaffolding of pedagogy and teaching to his students always at all moments. And what that always means is that on his final reviews, the jury sits around and kind of chews the fat for like an additional half hour to an hour. and talks about kind of big issues. And I always look forward to it every semester. I feel like I can never get enough of it. It's very challenging to do in studios with large numbers because you have to rush to get through everybody in an afternoon or part of a day. But because we're a relatively small cohort this year, we've got still a little bit of time before we, reasonably have to kind of release everybody back into their lives. And I just thought it would be really nice to take 20 minutes or a half an hour and talk about some of the things that seem like they're almost steroidally at stake right now, right? Whether that be things that have to do with the stakes of doing or not doing a thesis in education, or how education has had to kind of retool itself on the fly in the last month and a half, given the kind of hyperbolic nature of what we're all subjected to at the moment. How that is, so much of that is an architectural problem, actually, which I think, certainly Ryan, your project points to it pretty clearly here at the end. So I just wanted to open up the conversation to some broader things and give us a kind of forum to talk about them for a little while.
Thanks for the feedback. Sorry, thank you for
by the way, we didn't celebrate Ryan. You're done. Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I appreciate the feedback.
I think one thing that was interesting to me, because it was only Heather and me and the students that were here morning and afternoon. So we saw the total of 8 projects, and 6 out of the 8 projects were about domesticity, were residential projects, and all of them in this way of, in a humble way, questioning or revisiting domesticity. So it was not big housing projects or anything like that, but really single family projects, and it's very interesting on many levels, because of course they all started almost a year ago to talk about those projects and start developing them, so way before any quarantine and any of us being locked up at home. But it makes a lot of sense at the same time, of course, now to look at it from this perspective. And also then, while at the same time, I've been talking to friends in Germany especially about this idea is the Biedermeier returning again, so this return to the safety of your house because of the political situation that is not the safest. So I just thought, also looking back in the last years, we never had that many residential projects. It was always much more of a mixture, and that's just a very interesting observation to me.
Heather, was that intentional?
No.
Was that
I really try and give these guys the longest leash that I can for them to make all of these choices themselves. I mean, sometimes I make suggestions if they're sort of struggling between a bouquet of choices, but these were all fairly natural decisions from what I can remember. I mean, in some cases, the choices were made in the fall, and maybe even quite early in the fall, and in some cases they evolved maybe a bit later in the process.
I actually would love to hear from the students a little bit, to me, and this is just me, but one of the defining characteristics of a capstone project, whether it's for master's or undergrad, is a kind of declaration of who you are as an author, being kind of, leaving the academic incubator and going out into the world. And I'd love to hear from the students how do you understand yourselves as authors now at this point? This is like this as in Ryan's project, with the Tessio quote of every threshold looks forward and backward at the same moment. I think you're all at one of those moments right this very during this conversation? How do you understand yourself as a person going out into the world with a point of view at this point, at the end of your degree?
Would it be easier to talk if we weren't here?
It's already done. It's not like it's going to go bad, you know. It's like it's. You've all had wonderfully successful presentations.
Do we turn off?
I mean, just going, thinking back to the quote, and also the fact that we're kind of in this like pause moment with everything going on. It's easier to look back and understand hindsight's 2020. Looking forward, I think right now in the present times, at least me, is a little bit more challenging in terms of understanding what should be cared about, even more so now, I think, with the pandemic and the health and safety of the world. So I don't know, but looking forward, it's exciting, but it's definitely a little scary.
Yeah, I think a lot of times, actually really similar to Ryan's project, where she's like focusing on like small details and like things that maybe other people don't like realize a lot of times, is like a side conversation can or like a side comment, something like that's not the main subject, can kind of stick with you for like a long time, and you think about it a lot. I think like at work, like at the place I interned, a lot of side conversations with the coworker and the coworker has helped me with the project. So right now, Mitchell, when you said as a designer and an architect yourself, you're rethinking like your house where you live, and not just a place where you eat and sleep before you leave. And kind of like when an architect says that, and it's like the rest of the people really do, in like the society we live in, treat their homes as kind of like a hotel room. They just sleep and eat, and then but the rest of the day that everybody's out and they just kind of come back in. But what does it mean to like put a lot of thought into the place that you live in and really customize it, where like if you stay in for a long time, you don't get bored. So I think like that's a small comment that I'm always going to keep with me like as I go on. And that's just one example. There has been a lot of comments that a lot of jurors have made that like one thing stays with me, and I always go back to that. So I appreciate having an advisor like Heather first and foremost, but also like everyone that Heather has brought has helped us so much.
I think too that, you know, if I mean, it's hard for me not to see our current times as sort of perilous times, in so, you know, in a lot of different ways in our lives right now. Certainly in a public health way, politically, economically, we're at a moment, I think, where uncertainty is at a kind of higher value of a higher value of presence than it would have been 10 years ago. I would just encourage all of you that as you probably get more clarity on what you've just gone through, that nurturing that point of view as something which allows you to create a body of work which will transcend decades of your working and creative life. Like, if you are looking for something to hold on to and sustain you through perilous times, I would say that would be it. And I think you've all got such a solid start on it right now that, you know, I would just encourage all of you to be hyper aware of it and also very protective of it.
I mean, I just want to add to that a little bit to say that, it's funny because I've been, like all of us, trying to assess what it is we're going through and so on. I have to say, there are two countervailing impulses, and I think they're both reflected in what you were sort of just discussing. One of them is to reassert the real, to reinvest in certain aspects, like we were just sort of saying, like within our domestic sphere and things like that. Ironically, though, there are other vectors, so to speak, that are in the opposite direction. Like, it's likely we're moving towards a kind of a post-ownership era in economics, when, your generation likely will never own a car. I think that's a fairly safe thing to say for some of you, and ownership of a house, maybe that's all in the past. I mean, Elon Musk tweeted yesterday that he's not going to own anything, which is easy for him to say. But it's still, it's speaking for something that's out there. It's a believable. There are already ways of renting all your clothing, renting your furniture, renting your house, renting your vehicles. And I mention this just to sort of say that may sound like belonging to the language of Silicon Valley disruptive thinkings, let's say, but it's much bigger than that, right? And as people in the design world, we know that we straddle these realms of the kind of profound and eternal, but also the superficial, the idea of consuming culture. And I'm just sort of saying that that we want to make the most of, sorry, Siri just turned on. I must have said something that sounded like, hey, Siri. Anyway, I just want to say that, this is a moment where we need to think, we need to be flexible to realize that it's not just a matter of understanding what's always been, let's say, permanent and important. It's also an opportunity to let go of certain things that maybe weren't important in the first place. I mean, once again, the other thing that people talk a lot about is the environment and how, in some ways this has been a blessing for the planet. The ozone hole over Antarctica closed up a couple of weeks ago, and so on. And I don't know. I just think it's a positive way of looking at this, is to say that we can, we can look at what to hold on to, what to let go of in different ways.
I wanted to add one thing, and unfortunately I'm going to have to, I have one more review to try to get to. But I today was wonderful, and you're all students and you're all allowed to take this time to express yourself. But I think that what's happening today reinforces what I've heard a lot of you say, and it is that design matters. And it matters because it's the spaces we inhabit, and there is no more potent experiment than the one we're in now that will tell you how important it is that the spaces that surround us make a difference to our lives. And right now we are all in these tiny little spaces, but it works at multiple scales. And so as you go out into the world, I will never forget one of our students once said to me, and I thought it was so eloquent, that somebody asked them, who do you imagine in the spaces that you design for? And he said, I design for the people I love. And I just thought that was such a beautiful thing to say. And imagine that the design that you're making is for the people that you love the most. And that will then allow you to make really incredible decisions. So I wanted to thank you all for today and thank the jury. And I'm going to just hope that you guys keep talking, and I'm going to log back in to hear the end of the conversation. Thank you, Christoph, for tape recording in this. Thank you, Heather. You've done an amazing job. And what's so amazing, I love seeing all the work of all the students, but you're able to respect the student's voice but I'll give them the tools to get them to a whole other level. And I'm seeing all the students going like this, and you have my eternal gratitude and respect. And you are an amazing, now I'm getting all choked up. You're an
I know. I don't know if you guys realize, but I've been crying for like the whole day.
You're an incredible instructor, and I feel
a hot mess over here.
Blessed to have all of you in my life. So I'm going to go now before I start choking up. Bye, everybody.
Bye, Ingalil.
Thank you. Thank you, Ingalil.
Let's all have one big cry. I need one. Ready.
It feels good.
I mean, just to shift gears, I was gonna say that some of the things I've been noticing as we're teaching online is that in some ways it's been quite productive. Like I don't know if you guys concur, we're all doing it, but it's productive in that I think that there's less time being wasted on things that might be wasted. Obviously the driving to and from studio, I'm not talking about that, but just being in studio and then that things, having a conversation and in sharing media in various ways, it just tends to be a lot more straightforward and kind of need-based. So I've been actually pleasantly surprised by that.
Yeah, there's a few things that I've noticed. One thing I noticed in stark contrast today, which is that every single one of these students to the last presented like they've never presented before, verbally. Every single one of you was incredibly clear and articulate in a way that you have not been in the flesh reviews. And I think part of that probably comes from the pressure cooker of only really having the verbal with some assistance of the visual very flattened, right? And you have to work a lot harder to verbally articulate a point because it's the primary means of communication, right? And that really is a kind of representational issue, right? When we're sitting shoulder to shoulder and we can kind of sketch together with a certain sort of deftness, and we're relying a lot on physical gesturing and body language, we don't have to be so precise in what we say or so prepared in what we say. And so this gets to another point, which is that I've seen a kind of huge spike in resiliency, which I always have thought about as kind of one of life's greatest assets. Like if you're resilient and you can be nimble and agile and you can kind of adapt and find a way through something, you're going to do okay in life. And it's certainly an asset for any designer to have, because we're in the business of making the future and being in the future just a slightly ahead of most other people, which is one thing that gives me a tremendous amount of faith in terms of where you are all poised as you now go out into the world in this very uncertain moment, because you're much better prepared given your education than almost any other person on the planet to make a future for yourself, to be able to kind of navigate uncertainty, because that's what you do all the time when you're designing something. And I think you're going to be okay. You're all going to be okay. Not only that, I think you can find ways to really thrive and to help other people. And I can't imagine a more exciting scenario to engage in right now.
Or worthwhile.
Agreed. I think you're all going to be busy. Whether you want to be or not, you're going to be busy. I'm curious, maybe even in slightly more practical ways, like we found in our studio, and a lot of this might be my dysfunction more than anything else, that at least for the first couple of weeks, everything took 2 to 3 times longer. Like I think the first couple of weeks, there were a few days where I actually split studio up into 2 days. So we were almost having studio like 3 to 4 days a week, because I couldn't talk to anybody for less than an hour. And at a certain point I was like, how is this going to work? You know, the hours are just not sustainable. We're all going to burn out, or, you know, none of us are going to eat and we're going to lose 30 pounds and that seemed to have gotten more manageable over time, but certain things do seem to take a lot longer, and then other things actually seem more streamlined in a bizarre way. I don't know if that's been anyone else's experience.
For me, it's been hard to feel like I'm removed from the medium around which we're having discussions, and it's taken a while through various tools to start to be able to like sketch or contribute in a kind of graphic conversation with students, which is really important to me. So that was a bit of a upward.
How did you resolve it? I'm just curious.
We use Miro a lot. And that's helped quite a bit, you know, with students. So, and the more drawings get developed, I think the more fluid that conversation is, because the sort of increments of adjustment are smaller, and the kind of polemic of the polemic of the kind of project is more settled. And so, yeah, I guess in the beginning it was a bit more daunting.
I think too, it's been interesting. I think, you know, once we all got over the initial shock and the steep learning curve, I think it's been incredibly, this way of teaching has been incredibly good for me in terms of working in a very focused way on specific things with students in a way that in an open studio I could never get enough acoustic separation, enough separation from other people wanting to interrupt the conversation or anything like that. With Zoom, it's just wonderful. I think the starvation part of the education, which is so irreplaceable, is just the students not being around each other. I mean, I know that's the obvious. We all knew that was going to be a big missing piece of everybody's education this spring, but I can really see the effects of that in my own students' work. You know, with a small cohort, I guess it would be, maybe I should just ask the students, did you guys get together at off times on Zoom to share work? A little, but at least some. I think that's really, really healthy and really smart. And I think as educators, as pedagogues, Heather and Tim and everyone else, that you know, finding ways to kind of substitute another medium for that exchange directly between students is really needed right now. In a really obvious way, a shared space.
Yeah, I guess I'm just going to chime in again about, not to get so meta all the time, but like, I have to say, like, the fact that there's this globally shared circumstance, you know, obviously everyone's experiencing it differently, and that's important to keep in mind. You know, people don't have the same conditions that they are enduring this with, that's for certain. But the general, you know, like no one, it's sort of like, I mean, it's a weird analogy, but I'm going to say it anyway, which is that, you know, like the smartphone comes out, and then all of a sudden the wealthiest person on the planet has no better technology than the next person who can afford the smartphone. Like, obviously there's still a threshold, but there's this unifying culture changing thing. And at least within certain margins, you don't have access to more of it or less of it. And here is this circumstance that no one has the therapy for this virus, right? No one has access in any more profound way to it. And I'm just saying, like, teaching wise, there's been this interesting, I don't know, it's like this weird through line. Like, we all know that it dominates the news, right? There's not a news story that you can hear that doesn't have a pandemic connection to it. Every conversation is preceded by the normal preamble of getting out of the way, how you're enduring this thing. And I mean, it's maybe obvious to point out, but I think from a teaching perspective, when so much of teaching is kind of building tiny little bridges, lots of tiny bridges to connect your subjective experiences together across time and across space and everything. I don't know. I'm just saying that I think it's kind of changed the temperature of teaching. There's this different. I don't know. Maybe it's more. I feel more kind of emotional about my connections sometimes with students. Like we're kind of going through this together. Someone has some sort of thing they can't get done, and they're a little bit frustrated by it. And I feel like almost instantly sympathetic. Like, dude, I get it so much. I get it right now, you know. And then if someone really overcomes a hurdle, we all kind of know at least a little bit the degree of a challenge that represents now. I don't know. I just think it's an interesting. It's just interesting to have a shared globally shared. It's not like, like if someone's sports team, everyone's doing well, like, yay, go Dodgers or whatever, like that's a very regional shared experience or something. But like, it's pretty unusual to have something where I talk to friends overseas and it's like we can have the same conversation. I don't know. Somehow to me that seems relevant in a conversation about teaching because it's about those bridges.
I've actually been wondering if, this is going to go on for a while. What a while means is to be determined. But, if the Spanish influenza of 1918 is any kind of indication, until we have a vaccine or until we have therapeutics, we're going to be in some form of this for a duration, for a while. And there's a couple of things about that could actually be pretty incredible, which is that, when you had something like 9/11 that happened, New Yorkers in particular, I think, rallied together in a way and cared for each other and were enormously kind of sympathetic and empathetic with one another and redefined community, at least for a while. And then eventually I think it sort of, faded back and people returned to, patterns of behavior prior to that event to a certain extent. But I wonder if this thing actually went on for long enough that we could fundamentally rewire the way that we behave, the way that we relate to ourselves, the way that we relate to other people, the way that we live, and the way that we consume and occupy the planet, that we might actually be able to fundamentally change all of it. And of course, that will happen on the backs of lots of people suffering in all kinds of ways, in terms of either health or, economics or otherwise. And, but I wonder how much like education could fundamentally change, like does the notion of a semester suddenly become totally irrelevant and we find some other durational model to experiment with? Or, the dynamics of sort of teacher to student, does that suddenly become kind of irrelevant? Or is there a series of alternatives that are somehow more compelling? And I'm just wondering if our institutional structures can be nimble enough to allow us to experiment with education in those ways.
Well, there's nothing like an existential threat to help us change.
Yeah.
But I think it's something we've talked about sporadically over the years. I think that higher education, especially, was on an inevitable path to crisis, just in terms of its inability to kind of adapt to the world that we're training students to go out into, in ways that were meaningful. And I can say that for sure, working for the CSU as I have for the past couple decades, which is an incredibly stubborn, hidebound bureaucracy. So I, in a very perverse way, I think this could be a moment where if the opportunity is grasped, it could become the thing that saves it. And I think the idea of continually, I'll just say, I teach at a school where most schools, all our studio meetings, the studio space, the studio meeting times, all that is coming right out of the 19th century. I mean, this is the Beaux-Arts. We go, we work with the master, we spend our time, we acquire skill, and then we go back out of the academy into the world. All of that now just seems incredibly hard to sustain, and it probably. I'll be really curious to see what the next 10 years. I know that a lot of people that pay attention to overhead and costs are going to use this to threaten the quality of what we do. But I also know a lot of really creative people in the institutions are going to bring up proposals and opportunities that completely subvert those efforts to kind of water down the quality, how shall I put it, educational excellence. But I do think it's a moment to look forward and be very energetic.
So I really appreciate the kind of, I don't know, maybe I appreciate the thoughtfulness and the kind of embrace at an alternative, because obviously this situation is like kind of opening up the weak, the rifts that is like part of our society. So it's really kind of like, you know, making us confront these things. On the one hand, I think there's like a kind of duration that we're all trying to sort of like manage in our own different ways. Like for instance, being closer to New York, or at least my family being closer to New York, having a different relationship. You know, it's like, you know, still in the emergency mode and still in the crisis mode, you know, and versus, let's say, someone who has a different experience and has a different kind of distance from all of it. I think there's probably a way to think about education in all those different needs as we move forward, because whether it's a socioeconomic kind of like fundamental difference of, you know, equity, or how different learning capacities. One may engage, let's say, the online mode better, versus another may have a kind of learning engagement which may be much more tactile, right? So I think like we might actually come across different, maybe articulating different modes of learning that each of us are more susceptible to. And I think it's also interesting to think about, so for instance, you know, the reviews that the projects that we just saw have had the experience of, let's say, working in a non-online way. And so I think there's, and it's also in seeing the work that there's clearly a kind of embodied knowledge of what has sort of built over time. And I hope that that part is not forgotten, because that is an intrinsic part of understanding architecture and interiors and even histories. So I wonder how, as we move forward, especially when we have, let's say, a new class that will be coming in, how we might bring those kind of heuristic knowledge back into play. And that's something that I personally, for me, I deal with a lot, because I work with students on prototyping. And so if you don't have the kind of analytical, physical making capacity, how are we learning through that process, right? So I think there's like, you know, and I think that's where some of the conversation for pedagogy and teaching in the, how do we redefine it, and what are the different modes of learning that begins to shape those pedagogy.
Yeah, I'd be very curious to see. I mean, who knows what's going to happen with fall semester, but we all benefited from having half of a semester in the flesh before all this happened. I'm curious to know what a semester without that is like, what it's like for us, like an incoming freshman, right? But then also, if this gets slightly to Mitchell's point about the powers that be up at the top who are running the numbers, seeing this as an opportunity to kind of leverage toward full online learning because it's cheaper. I wonder how effective this mode would be right now without the pandemic, which is a kind of weird way to phrase it. But I do think that the collective urgency of the moment is actually making this possible in whatever ways it's possible. And I have a lot less faith in this as an educational model without that.
I think that comes right back to Tim's point where the kind of hidden benefit of this being a kind of leveler across humanity and really for all, all the perversity of that, like us all benefiting from that moment of coming back into kind of level with each other. And the danger, I think, that what you're talking about raises, I think it's the danger that, I've worked for several schools of architecture who have been resisting online education, versions of architectural education for a long time now. I think the real danger is that once the pandemic has passed, it will get into a two-tier situation.
Mm.
And the kind of discrepancy between finding yourself in an educational environment where overhead costs for a physical plant can no longer be sustained, as opposed to one where they can, is really scary to me as a former student and as a teacher. And that will be a moment of peril. I'm predicting right now. But I'm always good at predicting pessimistic things. It's my talent. I have a Norwegian talent for it. It'll all go bad, trust me.
Well, I don't want to keep our jury longer than I had obligated them all to. But I really want to thank you for all sharing your Sunday with us, especially those of you that are much farther afield and it's much later in the evening. But it's really great to see all of you and to have all of you share such rich conversation with our students.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it was a real.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, congratulations. This was
everybody.
Good work.
Yes.
Congratulations, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care. Be safe.
Yes.
Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Students, can you stay on the line? Can the students stay on the line? Is it going to cancel out the rent clock?
Yeah, let me.
Bye, Tim. Bye, Narne. Bye, Tian.
Let me turn off the stream.